Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We've been learning about the table of the Showbread, which sits inside the Heichal, the sanctuary of the Holy Temple, one of the three major vessels of the Holy Temple, and the table of the Showbread containing the 12 loaves of specially baked bread, which is not leavened bread, is the vehicle that brings about blessing into the world and sustenance. And this table, we know, is, as it reads in Exodus 25, you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits its length, 1 cubit its width, and 1.5 cubits its height, and it's overlaid with pure gold. We have the description in those verses that we read before. And the main verse that we really need to deal with right now in chapter 25 of the book of Exodus is verse 29. Verse 29 reads, "And you shall make its forms, its spoons, its half-pipes, and its supports, with which it will be covered of pure gold, you shall make them." And then, of course, the Torah continues, "And you shall place them on the table, and you shall place on the table showbread before me at all times." This translation that I just read to you of verse 29 is actually very, very accurate. It's really a good one. You're going to find, as we've discussed before, that different translations have various pluses and minuses, various strengths and inadequacies. And here in particular, we're dealing with a verse that features Hebrew words that are rather strange and rather unusual. And so this is an absolutely excellent translation, which perhaps you haven't seen before, verse 29, and that's why I want to repeat it again, and then we'll see why it's so important. You shall make its forms, its spoons, its half-pipes, and its supports, with which it will be covered. These are actually the translation of the words karotav, kapotav, kisotav, and manikiotav, that we're translating here as forms, spoons, half-pipes, and supports. And we are up to halacha Yud Gimel, the 13th entry, the 13th halacha of chapter 3, Perek Gimel, in the Rambam Hilchot Beit Habechira. And here, really, Maimonides needs to refer to these concepts, and we need to have a very clear definition of these rather unusual and even mysterious words that the verse employs to describe the components, the physical parts of the table itself. You see, the verses that we just read, and especially this particular Hebrew verse, "Ve'asita karotav, ve'kapotav, ve'kasotav, u'mnikotav, asher yisach behen, zahav tahor ta'aseh otam." It's the Talmud in Tractate Menachot that goes into a very lengthy explanation of conceptually of what these parts of the table are. And there we have this description, karotav, its forms. These are the templates. They're like baking pans. They're not actually part and parcel of the table. They're the forms that are, or maybe you'd call them the molds that are used for baking the bread. Kapotav, its spoons. These are the censers for the frankincense. There's actually a commandment, one aspect of the service of having the showbread on the table, of displaying it before the presence of Hashem, and of having it there all week long, is that there are also 2 small containers, you could call them incense bowls or censers, containing pure frankincense that are placed in a certain way between the loaves as well. And this is also, actually, you will see, is part of the temple service, because the frankincense doesn't only stay on the table before the loaves, it's also going to be offered before Hashem at one point. And then the verse continues, kisotav, its supports. These are the 2 frames. They are side frames, or kind of like stands that the groupings of the breads rest on these frames, on these 2 frames that are up against the sides of the table. And manikiotav, its half-pipes. These are the rods, kind of like pipes, that the breads actually rest on. So we have these side frames at the sides of the table, and we have these half pipes. We'll see exactly how many of them there are, and exactly how they're constructed and how they look. And on these kanim is the language of the Talmud, nikiotav. on these half pipes the breads actually rest. Now, Rashi explains to us some details about the derivation of these words and how our sages reached the conclusion of identifying exactly what these components of the table are. Ksotav, it's actually play on words, comes from the same root as kasheh, shemaksheh halechem umichazko. They actually help the bread to harden and they strengthen it. And he continues in his explanation of the derivation of the words regarding the snifim, ksotav, these side pieces. These are golden supports that stand on the ground, and they reach a height higher than the table itself, and they are split at the top, and there are 6 groupings, rather there are 6 shelvings, split shelvings that contain the breads, this one higher than that, and the pipings fit into these supports, into these side frames, and the bread rests upon these this framework of these half pipes in between the side pieces, the frames, so that the bread itself is not too heavy, in other words, for itself, so that the top breads are not resting on the bottom ones, which would cause them to break. And Maimonides also, in his more lengthy explanation, explains the concept of these side points, side frames, as supports that stand at the side of the table, that every pair of supports, each pair of supports holds up, in essence, a distribution of 6 chalot, 6 breads, and in between these frames rest these half pipes, which are actually the shelving that hold onto the breads. So, we haven't actually read the halakha together yet, because I wanted to explain the importance of the derivation of all of these concepts from the verse in the book of Exodus. Maimonides actually reads, Arba snifin shel zahav hayu lashulchan. 4 supports, golden supports, or frames, stood at the table. Mifutsalin mirashehen, they were split at the top. Shayu somchin bahen shtei hamarachot shel lechem hapanim, and they supported the 2 groupings of the showbread. Shnayim miseder zeh, ushnayim miseder zeh. 6 in this order, as it were, 6 on this side, and 6 on this side. V'heim hanemarim b'Torah, and this is what the Torah refers to as uksotav, its supports. And this is why it's so important for us to understand that the written Torah, in many ways, is like a field that is waiting to be harvested by the participation of the oral Torah. And this is something that we see very often when we study together, the beauty of understanding and appreciating and deriving benefit from the connection between the written Torah and the oral Torah. Here we have a verse 29 of chapter 25, which can be translated any number of ways, and if you will read in various translations about these 4 words, the different parts of the table, you will not walk away with any clarity of vision whatsoever about what the table actually looks like. Comes along the sages of the Talmud who received the tradition from Moses and who enter into a deep dissertation and understanding and analysis of exactly what these words mean, what their basis is, what their derivation is, and how we can understand the actual construction of the table. And of course, if you are in a position, as we are, where we actually want to bring this halakha l'maaseh, which means we want to bring it to a practical conclusion, we want to actually apply the concepts here and create the table so as to fulfill the commandment, then you really have to be in a position to understand exactly what it is that we're referring to. So this is the main section of the Talmud that you have to be aware of, wherein there's the most important discussion regarding understanding the construction of the table. And the concept of these half poles is also something which is very, very important. On every grouping, in other words, on the two between the side frames, we have the two groupings of 6 breads each. And the concept of these half pipes, there are actually, we're going to see in the next halakha, there are 28 of them altogether. They are like called by the Talmud like half a reed, 14 on each side. And these pipings enabled the flow of air to go uninhibited in between the loaves, which also is something that lent to the freshness of the bread. So even though our sages emphasize, and this is something that we speak about a great deal, there was a certain miraculous aspect to the nature of the showbreads, and we're going to be learning a little bit later about the actual baking of the breads, who was responsible for it, what they looked like. It's something also that there are a number of opinions about. They were extremely unusual looking breads, and they also had this feature which was clearly touched by the divine, in that they did not become moldy or stale, but they also remained hot all week long. A certain aspect of this was actually related to the human element. It was an expertise of this particular family of the priesthood that we're going to be learning about, that they actually possessed a secret knowledge, a recipe, if you would, of how to how to bake these breads in a manner that they would not become stale. But I think the concept of their freshness relating to the fact that they remained piping hot, I think that is something that clearly was attributed to the miraculous. But there's two kind of points or features to the breads not being stale. One was that they didn't get moldy, which was something that the bakers knew how to do, probably also aided by divine intervention and guidance. But the heat itself, I think, is something that only Hashem was in control of. But here again, especially according to Maimonides, who explains that many of the miracles that are described in the Talmud were things that can be explained through natural means, because I guess you would say, according to the Rambam, the most miraculous situation is when we simply do the right thing and we follow the mitzvot. Then we deserve that Hashem should bless our efforts in such a way that the best that can possibly happen will happen, which is really all within the natural realm. But these half pipings, as we're going to see, enabled the bread on a natural level to remain as fresh as possible. Halacha Yud Dalid tells us, "V'chav chet kanim shel zahav, kol echad mehen kechatzi kaneh chalul hayu lo." The table featured 28 rods of gold, each of them like half a reed, which was hollow. Each of them half a hollow reed. Arba asar l'seder zeh, v'arba asar l'seder zeh. 14 of these hollow half golden reeds on each side. V'hem hanikraim menikiotav. And this is the word that is used by the Torah in chapter 25, verse 29, that we're translating here as its half pipes. Ushne habazichin shamanichin bahen halavona al hashulchan bitzad hamarachot hein hanikrain kapotav. And then the two bazichin, two small ornamental containers that are sometimes called censers or incense bowls, these contained pure frankincense, and these were actually placed on the table itself, in between the stackings of the breads, and these are called kapotav, which we are translating here as its spoons. V'hadefusin she'osin bahem lechem hapanim, and the actual molds, or I guess you'd call them forms, really, in which the showbread was baked. These are called karotav, which we're translating here as its forms. So, here Maimonides is really explaining, according to the verse, verse 29, chapter 25, which, according to our sages of blessed memory, in tractates Menachot, have explained exactly how these parts of the table work and how we see them in the verse. Here Maimonides is explaining to us exactly how the table is set up. So we have 28 of these hollow golden half rods all together, And we're going to learn about exactly how the breads are set up on the table, when they are set up, and how they are placed there and removed, because after all, there is a positive commandment that the bread is supposed to be there all the time. Again, regarding this unique system of these half rods of gold, which actually formed the shelves themselves upon which the breads rested. But again, the shelf was 3 pieces, and there's plenty of room for air to go in between, and in between the stacks themselves. Rashi, again, there in Tractate Menachot, explains to us, again, his principle there in that particular piece of Talmud is that he derives something from each of these words, and this is called Menakiotav. He explains that it's a kind of a play on words. It comes from, the root of the word is naki, which means clean. He explains that these half rods serve to cleanse the bread from becoming stale, and that is again because of the spaces, large spaces between the chalots. This enabled and facilitated air to flow between the breads. This is actually according to Rashi. I must say, I think we're going to realize that according to the Rambam himself, in the next halacha, Tet Vav, I believe that he seems to indicate that there was no actual space between the breads themselves. So this is something that we have to clarify. In the Torah itself, we find, not in Exodus, but later in Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 24 and verse 7, there we have Hashem's positive commandment that pure frankincense has to be placed on the table. V'natata al hamarechet levona zakah. You shall place on the arrangements of the table pure frankincense. V'hayita lelechem leazkara lifnei Hashem. And it shall be for the bread for a remembrance before Hashem. And basically, the way our sages describe it is that in the free tefach between the two marachot, between the two arrangements of bread, on the surface of the table itself, this is where these censers of frankincense were placed. After all, the length of the table was 12 tefachim, and each one of the arrangements of the bread on the table had a length of 5 tefachim. That means that there was a free space of 2 tefachim between the two arrangements. And in this space, on the actual surface of the table, were placed these 2 censers of frankincense. As I mentioned, the frankincense itself, not only was it placed on the table because Hashem commanded it, and it's part of the actual arrangement of the lechem hapanim, that a feature of the bread being in the presence of Hashem all week long is also the frankincense placed in between the loaves, but the frankincense was also offered as kind of like an incense offering. And that's why the verse that we mentioned in Leviticus 24 calls it a remembrance. Because on the Sabbath day, every Shabbat, this frankincense was removed, the previous weeks that is, and was actually offered on the altar. And this is part of the weekly cycle of the showbread. Now, regarding the frames that we learned about, the forms, by frames I really refer to the side frames, the supports of the table. Regarding the forms in which the bread was baked, the Rambam tells us in a different place, it's actually in his commentary on one of the Mishnayot, the Rambam tells us that there were 3 forms actually that were used in the process of the baking of the bread. 3 distinct forms, all of them were made of gold. There was one particular form in which the dough was placed when it was actually kneaded. There was another form in which it was actually baked, and there was a third form in which the bread was removed from the oven and placed into this particular, the third form. Rashi, on the other hand, in Exodus 25, tells us that there were only 2 forms. One was made out of steel, and that was used for the baking of the bread, and the second, made out of gold, was used to place the bread into until it was actually placed on the table. And we're going to be learning a great deal about the actual baking of the breads themselves, and It certainly is probably the most ancient recorded recipe of the Jewish people. So in the 15th halacha, halacha 15, Tetvav, the Rambam tells us, Elu ha'arba asar kanim noten hachala harishona al atzmo shel shulchan. V'noten ben rishona u'shniya shlosha kanim. How did the actual arrangement work? How were the breads placed on the table? As you can see from the illustrations and the photographs of the table, which was constructed in the Temple Institute according to the discourse and the analysis of our sages, as we mentioned exactly in tractates Menachot and in other places as well, understanding exactly the depth and the length and the meaning of Hashem's commandment in Exodus 25, verse 29, regarding all of the parts of the table. You see that these two side frames actually stood at the side of the table. They're not really part and parcel of the table itself. Whereas the table is the table made out of acacia wood, which is overlain with gold, and at the side of the table stood these frames, which are split at the top, and the frames feature the golden half pipes, the reed-like half pipes, from one side to the other, so that there are 2 arrangements of 6 on each side, and that means that there are 28 half pipes altogether, and it is on these half pipes that the breads actually would be placed, except for the fact that the 2 first chalot, or what you would call the bottom breads, were actually placed on the table itself. So on the actual surface of the table were placed the first 2 breads, and therefore they did not need any support. And then, as the Rambam tells us, v'notein ben rishona u'shniya shlosha kanim. But then, going up from the surface of the table, between the first and second breads, 3 of these kanim, these half pipes, were placed, so that the second pair of chalot were actually placed on these 3 half pipes. Now, according to Rashi, between each pair of breads, there is a certain degree of space, which allowed for a circulation of air. But interestingly, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam himself, it would seem that, especially when we look at this particular halacha that we're learning now, halacha 15, it would seem that the chalot were actually tzamud. They were uninterrupted. They were placed very close to each other, without any space. And according to the Rambam, the purpose of the tubes, of the half pipes, was actually only to separate them, but it didn't really allow any real space to speak of in between them. So interestingly, again, we find that the Rambam has an opinion all throughout, consistently, where in many beautiful examples he explains that many of the miracles that were recorded that took place in the temple were actually natural. And here we see that according to the Rambam, the miracle, as it were, that's described by our sages of the lechem hapanim, of the showbread not becoming moldy, is really even more miraculous, ironically, because it's Rashi who holds that there was a space between the breads that allowed for air to circulate between the loaves so that they didn't get all sticky and steamy and stale. And the Rambam actually says that the function of these pipes was only to make a distinction between the first and the second and the third row, but that they actually didn't provide for any circulation. And again, Rambam tells us, V'chein bein kol chala v'chala shlosha kanim. From the second set up, because again, the first set is actually on the table itself, from the second set up, between each chala, there are 3 half pipes. And again, that would mean that the third and fourth grouping are also placed on these 3 pipes, just like the second grouping. And again, ubein shishit v'chamishit shnei kanim bilvad. But between the 5th and the 6th chala, there are only 2 of these half pipes. Lefi she'ein al hashishit acheret, because there's nothing on top of the top grouping. In other words, the last pair of chalot were placed on only 2 pipings, because since there were no chalot that were resting on them, there was no concern that there would be anything too heavy on top of them. In other words, each row upon which there is another set of chalot had to have the 3 half pipes for support. But the top row, since there was no chalot on top of them, there were only 2 kanim. So, in conclusion, he tells us, Nimtzu arba'asar b'chol maracha u'maracha. In each grouping of the 2 groupings, there are 14 altogether. And this is the amount of the half pipes in the arrangement. 3 pipes between this, from the 2nd until the 5th. And as again, the first chalot are on the table itself, and then between the 2nd and the 5th set of chalot, there are 3 pipes each in between, and then there are 2 in between. There are 2 below the 6th chalot, so that altogether we have 14 half pipes in each arrangement, and altogether that would be 28 between the 2 arrangements. And this is how the breads were sitting on the table, and we're going to learn more and more about how the bread was actually created, who created it. Table of the showbread, one of the central features of the Holy Temple, representing the blessing that comes into the world through the light of the temple, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.